Have you ever really stopped to think about the names we use for the divine? I mean, where do they actually come from? Well, it turns out some of the most sacred names and symbols have these incredible hidden stories, tales of ancient shorthand, and believe it or not, even a major linguistic mix-up. So let's dig in and uncover that history together. I'm sure you've seen this symbol, the Cairo, right? Maybe in a church or on some ancient artifact. It looks kind of mysterious, doesn't it? But what if I told you it's basically just a form of ancient shorthand? Yeah, and it's not the only symbol with a really surprising story behind it. And then there's the name Jehovah. For so many people, it's the one true personal name of God. But for scholars, it's actually the result of a centuries-old mistranslation. So how on earth did a simple mistake become one of the most recognized names for the divine? Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start by decoding those sacred symbols. Then we're going to dive right into the heart of the mystery, that Jehovah mistranslation and the whole modern controversy around the name Yahweh. And finally, we'll wrap up by asking a much bigger question. If these names are this complicated, what does that teach us about prayer itself? All right, let's kick things off with those mysterious letters you see all over the place in churches, IHS and the Cairo. They might look like some kind of secret code, but their origins are actually way more practical, coming from a real need for ancient scribes. So what are they? Well, they're essentially ancient Greek abbreviations, or monograms. IHS is just the first three letters of Jesus in Greek. And the Cairo? Even simpler. It's just the first two letters of Christos. And this actually highlights a really key point. Christ wasn't a name, it was a title, meaning anointed one. These were just respectful, simple ways of writing things down. Okay, so from ancient shorthand, we're now jumping into a full-blown linguistic puzzle, the name Jehovah. And this is such a fascinating story of how a deeply sacred tradition accidentally led to a huge historical misunderstanding. So how did this even happen? It all goes back to around 300 BC. Out of this incredible reverence, the Jewish people stopped saying the divine name, represented by those four Hebrew letters, YHWH. Instead, when they were reading scripture aloud, they would say Adonai, which means Lord. Now, to help the reader remember to do this, scribes actually added the vowel points from Adonai right onto the consonants of YHWH. It was just a visual reminder. And for centuries, this system worked perfectly. Until translators who didn't know about the tradition made a huge mistake. And this is exactly where the big mix-up happened. Much later, translators saw the consonants of the divine name, YHWH, mashed together with the vowel sounds of the substitute word, Adonai. They had no idea it was just a reminder. They thought it was all one single word. The results? A brand new, hybrid word that had never existed before, Jehovah. And that is why Jehovah is now understood by pretty much all biblical scholars to be a mistranslation. It's the reason that if you go and pick up most modern Bibles today, you just won't find it. Instead, they honor that original practice by writing the Lord in all caps wherever YHW appears in the Hebrew text. But okay, what about Yahweh? A lot of scholars think that's a more accurate guess at the original pronunciation. So why don't we see that name used more often? Well, it turns out Yahweh has its very own, much more recent controversy. And this brings us to a surprisingly recent date, 2008. In that year, the Holy See, the central government of the Catholic Church, sent out a directive to bishops all over the world. And the subject was a request to stop using the name Yahweh in hymns and prayers during worship services. So the Vatican's reasoning here was basically twofold. First, historical tradition. The earliest Christians just followed the Jewish custom, using the Greek word for Lord, which is Kyrios. In fact, the specific name Yahweh was a super recent thing, only popping up in some Catholic hymns in the 1970s. But the second reason, and this one is arguably the most important, was to show profound respect for the Jewish faith and its ancient, unbroken tradition of not speaking the sacred name. So we've seen how Jehovah was a mistake, and why Yahweh became controversial. All this talk about specific names kind of forces us to ask a much bigger question. Is there even such a thing as a single correct name for God in the first place? Right. So after all that, what is God's true name? Well, the Bible's answer seems to be that no single name could ever be enough. In fact, when you actually look through the scriptures, you don't find one name. You find this beautiful variety of names and titles. Elohim, Lord, Holy One, the Almighty.
Jesus himself used the really intimate Aramaic term Abba, which is kind of like a little kid calling out Papa. But then on the cross, in that moment of absolute agony, he used Eloi. This variety isn't a contradiction, it's a revelation about relationship. The message here is pretty profound when you think about it. An infinite being simply can't be captured or contained by one finite human word. Each of these names is like a different lens, a pointer trying to describe one facet of a reality that's ultimately just way beyond our language to fully grasp. And that brings us to the ultimate point of all this history. If it's not really about finding the one correct name, then what is prayer really all about?
Maybe the best way to understand it is with this analogy. A loving parent who hears their child cry out, they don't argue about the specific word the kid uses, right? The parent just hears the need, recognizes their child, and responds with love. So the real takeaway here isn't historical or linguistic. It's deeply personal. It seems prayer isn't about finding the perfect label or knowing some kind of magic word. It's about the intention we have in our hearts and the relationship that we're trying to build. And that leaves us with a final question to think about. If even the most sacred names are really just pointers toward a relationship, what would change if we treated all names and labels that way? What if we started seeing them not as final definitions, but as invitations to a deeper connection?